The Hook. In 1944, on the blood-soaked sands of Iwo Jima, the most powerful military on Earth was blind. The Japanese Imperial Army was intercepting every radio signal, every command, and every plea for reinforcements. The American encryption machines were failing. Then, a soft, rhythmic clicking echoed through the radio static. It sounded like a chant, or perhaps the wind through the sagebrush of the Arizona desert. To the Japanese cryptographers, it was gibberish. To the U.S. Marines, it was the God voice. It was the Navajo language, a tongue the U.S. government had once tried to beat out of children in boarding schools, now becoming the only weapon that could win the Pacific War. This is the story of how the oppressed became the ultimate protectors. Chapter 1. The Silent Tongue of the Mesa. The story begins long before the thunder of the Great Wars in the red rock canyons of the American Southwest. Young Ki Yazi sat by the fire as his grandfather told him that their language was a gift from the holy people. "The words carry the shape of the mountains," the old man said. "If you lose the words, you lose the world." But the world was changing. In the 1920s, Ki was taken to a government-run boarding school. His long hair was shorn, and his traditional clothes were burned. If he spoke a single word of Navajo, he was beaten with a wooden ruler. "English is the only language of civilization," the teachers screamed. Ki learned to keep his language in a box inside his heart, a secret treasure hidden from the white man's world. Little did the teachers know that 20 years later, the very government trying to kill this language would be begging for it to save them. Chapter 2. The Choctaw Precedent, 1918. To understand the miracle of the Navajo in World War II, we must first look back to the mud of the trenches in France during World War I. The American expeditionary forces were being decimated. The Germans were experts at tapping telephone lines. They knew every move the Americans planned before they made it. Captain Lawrence of the 142nd Infantry stood in a dugout staring at his men. He noticed two soldiers, Solomon Louis and Mitchell Bob, chatting in a language that sounded like a rushing river. They were Choctaw Indians from Oklahoma. "Is that a written language?" Lawrence asked. "No, Captain," Lewis replied. "It is just us." Lawrence had a radical idea. He placed Choctaw men at every field telephone. Within 24 hours, the German intelligence officers were going mad. They had the best linguists in Europe trying to decipher the new American code. They couldn't even identify the language family. The Choctaw code talkers helped the 142nd capture several key German positions in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, ending the war weeks earlier than expected. Chapter 3. The Recruitment, 1942. Fast forward to the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. The United States was reeling. Philip Johnston, a veteran of World War I and the son of a missionary to the Navajo, remembered the Choctaw story. He knew that the Navajo language, Diné Bizad, was one of the most difficult in the world. It had no written form, and its syntax was a labyrinth that only a native speaker could navigate. He went to the Marine Corps. At first, they laughed. "You want us to use Indians to talk on the radio?" But Johnston gave them a demonstration. He brought in two Navajos who translated a complex military message into their native tongue and back into English in seconds. The existing encryption machines took 30 minutes to do the same task. The Marines were sold. Ki Yazi, now a man known as Thomas Begay, was among the first 29. They were taken to a secret bunker at Camp Pendleton. Their mission? Create a code within a language. Chapter 4. The Language of Iron. The Navajo soldiers realized that their language didn't have words for modern warfare. They had to invent them using the world they knew. A tank became a che de gahi, a tortoise.
A dive bomber became a guinea, a chicken hawk. America was Nehema, our mother. The commander-in-chief was Bikihe Dahi, the war chief. They memorized over 400 terms. Nothing was written down. If a Navajo code talker was captured, there would be no code book for the enemy to find. The code lived only in their breath. Chapter 5. The Hell of Iwo Jima. The climax of the story takes place on Iwo Jima. The island was a volcanic hellscape. Major Howard Connor, the signal officer for the 5th Marine Division, had 6 Navajo code talkers working around the clock. During the first 2 days of the battle, these 6 men sent and received over 800 messages. Every single one was perfect. Not a single mistake was made. Connor would later state, were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. Thomas, or Key, sat in a foxhole, the earth shaking from mortar fire. He relayed coordinates for the artillery. He spoke of tortoises and chicken hawks while bullets whizzed past his head. To the Marines around him, he was a magician. To the Japanese, he was a ghost. Chapter 6. The Silent Return. When the war ended, the code talkers were told they could never speak of what they did. The code was so successful that the U.S. military wanted to keep it a secret in case of a future war with the Soviet Union. Thomas returned to the reservation. He didn't get a parade. He didn't get the GI Bill easily. He went back to the same poverty he had left. When people asked what he did in the war, he simply said, "I was a radio man." For 23 years, the greatest linguistic feat in military history remained a classified secret. It wasn't until 1968 that the program was declassified. Chapter 7. The Honor of the Dene. In 2001, nearly 60 years after they stepped onto the beaches of the Pacific, the surviving code talkers were invited to the White House. They were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. Thomas, now an old man with silver hair and hands that shook slightly, stood in the rotunda. He wore his traditional turquoise jewelry over his Marine uniform. He thought of the teachers who had beaten him for speaking his language. He thought of his grandfather's words, "If you lose the words, you lose the world." He realized then that he hadn't just used his language to win a war. He had used the war to save his language.
Chapter 8. The Invisible Shield and the Secret of the Cipher. The year was 1942, and the Pacific was screaming. The Japanese Imperial Navy was moving like a tide across the Solomon Islands, and the United States was drowning in lost signals. Every time the Marines moved, the Japanese knew. Every time a supply drop was planned, the Japanese Zeros were waiting. The American machine-based ciphers, bulky mechanical monsters, were too slow for the jungle. They required power, a stable surface, and 20 minutes of frantic cranking and decoding. In a firefight, 20 minutes was an eternity. This was the atmosphere into which the first 29 Navajo recruits were brought at Camp Pendleton, California. They were known as the First 29. The birth of the living code. They were ushered into a windowless, high-security barracks. To the Marine officers, these men were an experiment. To the Navajo, this was a sacred task. Among them was Chester Nez, a man who had survived the boarding schools by whispering his language to the desert wind. Now, a Marine major stood before them. "You are here to build a wall," the major said, "a wall of words that the enemy cannot climb." The challenge was immense. How do you describe a grenade in a language that has no word for modern explosives? How do you say submarine to a culture that lived hundreds of miles from the ocean? The men sat in a circle, returning to the ancient Navajo tradition of the knot sheet, a gathering for decision-making.
They realized that they couldn't just speak Navajo, they had to create a code within a language. The lexicon of the natural world. They decided to map the machinery of death onto the creatures of the earth. It was a poetic irony. They used the beauty of the natural world to coordinate the destruction of an empire. The fighter plane. They called it Dahe-Tihihi, the hummingbird. It was small, fast, and could hover before diving. The battleship. They called it Lo-Tso, the whale, a massive creature of the deep. The bomb. They called it Eye-Shi, the egg, a shell that contained something inside. The colonel. He was the Hashke-Gi-Nata, the silver eagle, based on the insignia on his shoulder. For letters that didn't correspond to these terms, they used an alphabet system where each English letter was represented by a Navajo word for a common object. A became Walachi, ant. B became Shush, bear. C became Moasi, cat. The test of fire. The Marines were skeptical. They decided to run a race. They pitted a Navajo team against a state-of-the-art M209 cipher machine. Both teams were given a complex 4-paragraph tactical message. The machine team began frantically turning dials and consulting codebooks. They were fast, by military standards. They finished in 18 minutes. The Navajo team didn't have codebooks. They didn't have dials. They had their minds. They spoke into the radio, a rhythmic, haunting stream of whales, ants, and hummingbirds. They finished in 20 seconds. The major stared at his stopwatch. He couldn't believe it. He sent a second message, then a third. Each time, the Navajo were faster. More importantly, the Navajo were perfect. Because they weren't mechanical, they didn't jam. Because they were human, they could adjust their tone to cut through the static of a tropical storm or the roar of artillery. The burden of the secret. As the first 29 finished their training, they were given a final sobering briefing. They were informed that their role was so critical that they would often be assigned personal bodyguards. To the outside world, it looked like protection, but the code talkers knew the darker truth. Their bodyguards had secret orders. If it looked like a code talker was about to be captured by the Japanese, the bodyguard's job was to ensure the code remained a secret at any cost. They were the only soldiers in the U.S. military who were as much of a target to their own side as they were to the enemy. They were ghosts in the making. They were sent out to the Pacific not as men, but as the invisible shield of the Republic. As they boarded the transport ships, Chester Nez looked at the California coast one last time. He realized that very language the government had tried to kill was now the only thing keeping that government alive. Chapter 9. The Green Hell of Guadalcanal. The transition from the training camps of California to the front line of the Solomon Islands was like stepping into a different dimension. The code talkers arrived at Guadalcanal in late 1942, a place the Marines called the Canal, but which history would remember as a rotting, humid purgatory. The air was so thick with moisture you could almost chew it. The jungle was a wall of tangled vines, banyan trees, and razor grass that sliced through uniforms. But the most dangerous part of Guadalcanal wasn't the terrain, it was the silence. The Japanese 17th Army was expert in jungle warfare, hiding in spider holes and tree canopies, waiting for a single crack of a twig to open fire. The first transmission, a trial by fire. Among the new arrivals was Thomas Begay and a small detachment of the original 29. They were attached to the 1st Marine Division. On their first night, the tension was suffocating. The Marines were exhausted, plagued by malaria and dysentery. Suddenly, the Japanese began a banzai charge toward the perimeter. The field telephone lines were cut by mortar fire. The only way to call for naval gunfire support was the radio. Thomas pulled the heavy TBX radio onto his back. He felt the cold steel of the headset against his ears. On the other end of the line, miles away on a ship in the dark harbor, was another Navajo named Dan. "Identify yourself," the ship's operator barked through the static. Thomas didn't use the standard English phonetic alphabet. He didn't say Alpha, Bravo, Charlie. Instead, he began the chant, Belagana, Tsega, Walachi. For a moment, there was silence on the airwaves. The Marines in the foxhole with Thomas stared at him as if he had lost his mind. To them, it sounded like he was praying to the jungle. But on the ship, Dan's eyes lit up. He scribbled the coordinates onto a pad. Within 3 minutes, the massive 16-inch guns of the USS Washington roared into life. The shells whistled over the jungle canopy and slammed into the Japanese advance with surgical precision.
Friendly fire. The danger of being the secret. The Code Talkers faced a unique and terrifying threat, their own side. Because the Code Talker program was so top secret, many regular Marine units had no idea who these men were or why they were speaking a strange language into the radios. One afternoon, while Thomas was returning from a forward observation post, he was intercepted by a group of raw recruits from a different battalion. They saw a man with Oriental features, as the Navajo often shared physical traits with the Japanese, carrying a radio and speaking a language they couldn't understand. "I'm a Marine," Thomas shouted as they shoved him against a tree, a bayonet at his throat. "Yeah? Then why are you talking Jap on the radio?" a corporal snarled. Thomas was nearly executed on the spot as a spy. He was saved only when his commanding officer arrived and threatened to court-martial the recruits. From that day on, the bodyguards assigned to the Code Talkers weren't just there to keep the code secret, they were there to keep the Code Talkers from being killed by confused Americans. The Psychological War. As the battle for Guadalcanal dragged on, the Japanese intelligence officers, who were often educated at elite American universities like Harvard and Stanford, became obsessed with the new American cipher. They could break the high-level Army codes, but this jungle speech was impenetrable. They captured a Navajo soldier named Joe Kiyumiya, who was not a code talker, but a regular soldier in the 200th Coast Artillery. They tortured him, forcing him to listen to recorded radio transmissions of the Code Talkers. "What are they saying?" the Japanese interrogators demanded. Joe listened. He recognized the words. He knew it was Navajo, but because he hadn't been trained in the code within the language, it sounded like nonsense even to him. "It sounds like birds and bugs," Joe replied, bleeding from the interrogation. "You're lying," they screamed. The Japanese never realized that the Americans were using a dead language, in their eyes, to coordinate a modern war. The Code Talkers were winning the psychological war by simply being themselves. The Gullah Geechee of the Pacific. In the quiet moments between battles, the Navajo found a strange sense of peace in the jungle. They noticed that the local Solomon Islanders, who were also fighting the Japanese in their own way, had a deep connection to the land. Thomas saw a parallel between the struggle of his people in the American Southwest and the islanders' struggle for their homes. He realized that the code was more than just military jargon. It was a bridge. By using the words for whale, ant, and cloud, they were bringing the spirit of the Navajo Nation into the heart of the Pacific. They weren't just fighting for a flag. They were fighting to prove that their ancient culture was the most powerful weapon in the modern world. Chapter X: The Crimson Ash of Iwo Jima and the Silence of the Sage. By February 1945, the Pacific was no longer a vast blue playground. It had narrowed into a jagged volcanic throat called Iwo Jima. To the Japanese, this was sacred ground, the front door to the Japanese mainland.
To the Marines, it was an 8-square-mile slab of sulfur and black ash. Thomas Begay and a team of 6 Navajo from the 5th Marine Division stood on the deck of a transport ship looking at the silhouette of Mount Suribachi. The air smelled of rotten eggs from the sulfur vents. "It looks like the land of the dead," one of the men whispered. "No," Thomas replied, touching a small pouch of sacred corn pollen hidden in his pocket. "It looks like the earth is angry. We must speak to it carefully." The 800 messages of salvation. The landing was a slaughter. The black sand was so loose that the Marines couldn't dig foxholes. The Japanese had spent years carving miles of tunnels into the volcanic rock, turning the island into a literal fortress. When the Marines landed, they were pinned down by invisible fire. For the first 48 hours, the communication lines were a disaster. Runners were shot before they could deliver orders. Traditional radio frequencies were jammed with Japanese music and screams to confuse the Americans. But in the center of the chaos, the 6 Navajo code talkers remained a pillar of steel. They worked in pairs, one operating the crank, the other speaking into the handset. Under the shadow of Suribachi, they sent and received 800 messages in 2 days. Not a single word was mistranslated, not a single coordinate was lost. Major Howard Connor, the division's signal officer, watched in awe as the Navajo relayed the call for the flag raising on the mountain. When the message came through that the stars and stripes had been raised atop the peak, it was a Navajo voice that carried the victory. The secret of the grave. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the code talkers didn't get a ticker tape parade. As they prepared to ship home, a high-ranking intelligence officer gathered them in a room. "You are going home as heroes," he said, his voice cold and serious. "But you are heroes who do not exist. Your code is still top secret. If you speak of it to your wives, your children, or your newspapers, you will be prosecuted for treason. You are to tell everyone you were just radio operators, nothing more." Thomas returned to the Navajo Nation. He stepped off the bus in Gallup, New Mexico, wearing his uniform. He saw the "No Indians Allowed" signs in the windows of certain restaurants. He saw the poverty of his people, who were still fighting for the right to vote in their own ancestral lands. He wanted to tell his grandfather, "We saved the whale and the hummingbird." He wanted to say, "The language you taught me, the one they tried to beat out of me, was the only thing that could stop the rising sun." But he remained silent. For 23 years, the most astonishing military achievement in American history was a secret kept in the hearts of men who weren't even considered full citizens by many of their neighbors. The return of the holy people. In 1968, the program was finally declassified. The world learned that while the Germans had the Enigma and the Japanese had the Purple Code, which were both broken, the United States had the Dine Bizad, which was never broken. Thomas was now an old man. He was invited back to Washington, D.C. as the guest of honor. He stood among the few surviving members of the first 29. They were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor in the United States. As he held the gold medal, Thomas realized that the secret was finally out. He went back to the boarding school where he had once been punished for his tongue. He stood in front of a new generation of Navajo children who were now being taught their language as a source of pride. "They told us our words were worthless," Thomas told the children, his voice cracking with age. "But our words were the only thing the enemy could not steal. We didn't just win a war, we kept the wind from stopping." The end of the code. The story of the code talkers is the ultimate American paradox. It is a story of a people who loved a country that did not always love them back. It is a story of how the most primitive and ancient parts of a culture became the most advanced defense of a modern superpower. Today, the names of the code talkers are etched in the halls of the Pentagon. But more importantly, their language, once a secret weapon, is now a living, breathing song sung by their grandchildren in the canyons of Arizona. The code was never broken because it wasn't just a code, it was a soul.